Amazon is one of the largest tech companies in the United States. Amazon controls about 50% of the e-commerce user base in US and is the primary and perhaps only choice for many smaller companies to sell their products online. Therefore, Amazon can afford to maintain low product prices at the expense of their suppliers. But is Amazon a model of efficiency or is it a monopsony? Hi, my name is Dr. Andrew Tan. I'm a professor of economics at the University Science Malaysia. As part of our discussion on market failure caused by imperfect competition, we will refer to monopsony firms. We will discuss the characteristics of a monopsony market structure and how it makes its profits maximizing decisions. The competitive market structure is used as a basis for comparison. This leads to our discussion of social welfare laws that a monopsony firm creates and the resulting inefficient outcomes, which is a cause for market failure. In discussing market failure due to imperfect competition, we next focus on the monopsony market. The characteristics of the monopsony market are as follows. First, there is only one employer or buyer of the input market. While inputs normally refer to labor or workers, it can also refer to goods. Second, employer or buyer can exploit their bargaining power with suppliers of labor to negotiate for lower wage rates. They can also hire fewer workers than the competitive market. Third, the monopsony's employer or buyer must offer higher wages to attract additional workers. The fourth characteristic is that higher wages must be paid to all additional workers and all workers hired beforehand. Examples of monopsonies include large hypermarkets such as Tesco in Europe, which procure their goods from various smaller farmers. The hypermarket buys products from small farmers and exploit their bargaining power via late payments and lower product prices. These farmers do not have alternative buyers except being tied to contracts with these large hypermarkets. At the sports front, the National Basketball Association, or NBA in the United States, and the English Premier League, or EPL in England, are sports monopsonies wielding monopsony power in hiring and paying their players. These players must only play in this league as there are no other established leagues big enough in their respective sport. Closer to home, Genting Resorts is the single largest employer of workers who stay at the peak of Genting Highlands. Graphically, we note wages on the vertical axis and quantity of labor on the horizontal axis as we look at the input or labor market. In competitive labor markets, labor demand is denoted by DL while labor supply as L. These curves intersect at point Y with equilibrium wage and labor quantity WC and QC respectively. In a labor market dominated by a single employer, or as we call it, a monopsony, the marginal factor cost of labor curve, MFCL, diverges. This means that the MFC curve is steeper than the labor supply curve SL when the number of workers increase. This occurs because as more workers are hired, the wages for all workers have to be increased too. Hence, the MFCL curve slopes upward at twice the slope of the labor supply function, SL. A monopsony employer then asks, how many workers should I hire to maximize my profits? The employer compares the marginal value of workers, MRPL, to the marginal factor cost, MFCL. In the diagram, you can see the MRPL is downward sloping, while MFCL is upward sloping. Between 0 and QM workers, the MRPL is greater than its cost, MFCL. This occurs until point X, when MRPL and MFCL are equal to one another. Therefore, the profit maximizing employment level for the monopsony occurs at point QM. In comparison, QC points to the profit maximizing level of employment in the competitive market. Furthermore, the monopsony employer can determine the wage that it pays to QM workers based on the supply curve as L and at point Z. The wage to be paid to workers is therefore WM. In comparison, the competitive wage is WC. Note that monopsony firms can exploit their market power to pay lower wages to their workers. In this case, the monopsonist exploits its workers by setting lower wages at WM and employ fewer workers, QM, compared to the competitive market. This is similar to monopoly firms which exploit their market power to restrict output and charge higher prices for their goods. Let's take a look at this based on the concept of welfare analysis from the point of the competitive and monopsony markets. We want to compare the surplus based on labor demand or to the firm, and surplus based on the labor supply or to the workers. Next, we look at the social surplus. Under the competitive market, equilibrium occurs at point Y as labor demand DL is equal to labor supply as L. Surplus to the firm is area AYWC based on the area under the demand curve above the competitive wage WC. Surplus to workers is area WCYB based on the area above the supply function SL below the competitive wage WC. Social surplus is a summation of both surplus to the firm and labor, or area AYB. Meanwhile, monopsony equilibrium occurs at point Z at quantity of labor employed, QM, despite the fact that MFCL is equals to MRPL at point X. This is because the monopsonist can exploit the workers and will only pay workers WM wage level according to the labor supply function SL instead of the higher wage rate at X. Surplus to the firm under the monopsony market is therefore area AXZWM as shown in the highlighted diagram on the left. Again, this is found by the area under the demand curve of the firm and above the wage rate WM up until labor quantity QM. Surplus to the worker under the monopsony market is area WM ZB as highlighted. This is found by the area above the supply curve of the firm and below the wage rate WM up until labor quantity QM. Social surplus is a summation of both surplus to the firm and labor, or area A, X, Z, B. Comparing the social surplus from the competitive market to the monopsony market, we see a reduction in social surplus of area X, Y, Z. Market failure results from the area X, Y, Z that is not captured by the employer by hiring at QM quantity of labor and paying WM wage rate. We have just discussed what constitutes a monopsony firm. We looked at the characteristics of a monopsony firm, how a monopsony operates, and the social welfare losses that occur arising from a monopsony firm. This leads to inefficient outcomes, which leads to market failure.